The North against the South. Brother against brother. America's Civil War is the bloodiest in its history. Victory will take far more than brute firepower on the battlefield. Technology, communications, logistics. It's what happens behind the front line that will ultimately decide this battle for America's future. (1862). The American Civil War is at its height. North and South locked in a bitter conflict over the nation's future. A new kind of bullet has brought this war to a terrible deadlock, bringing death on a scale never previously seen in warfare. Here at a metal works in the state of Illinois, molten lead is beginning its journey to becoming a lethal instrument of destruction. The bullet known as the mini ball. This crude piece of lead is the primary reason for the unprecedented levels of slaughter in this war. Invented in France, it's just 30 grams in weight, just over a centimeter across. One person can cast 3,000 mini balls an hour. Each one of these simple bullets can rip through a man's body in a fraction of a second. The mini ball is used by the North and South alike. Demand for this killer bullet runs so high that an entire industry springs up, supplying mini balls to the front line. In total, the North makes over 500 million mini balls ready to be fired from the 2 million muskets it supplies to its men.
In many ways, the Civil War was the first modern war because it was the first war that took place after the Industrial Revolution had begun to transform our country.
It will take over 33 hours for a bullet in this box to travel the 1,300 kilometers to the battlefield, ready to find its target. The new musket is much faster to reload than traditional weapons. Load the gunpowder, ram down the bullet, and it's ready to fire.
Imagine warfare where your ability to load a musket faster than the guy with the other musket would determine if you lived or died.
troops on the inside of the barrel, rifling, spin the ball towards its target. The improved accuracy and range are a deadly combination.
1 second, everything's great. The next second, your buddy's head's gone, or his arm's flying off.
You don't want to know what a soft metal musket ball does when it enters the human body.
On impact, the bullet flattens out. Bone shatters and splinters. Causing further damage to muscle and tissue. More often than not, the result of a direct hit, death. But for all the mini-ball's technological edge, the Army still uses traditional military tactics.
What made it particularly tragic was modern technology meeting much more ancient tactics. So the death rates were truly appalling.
The troops still face one another openly in lines across the battlefield. But the mini-ball is accurate over a range of 550 meters. Easily spanning this distance. And it can be reloaded 8 times faster than a traditional weapon. The effects are catastrophic. The kill rate increases dramatically compared to previous wars. Across the battlefield, the results are carnage. Blood and death on a previously unseen scale.
They killed each other in droves, in lines, and in piles.
Soldier Alexander Hunter writes,
"One lay on his face with his body almost in 2 parts. Another was shot just as he was taking aim. One eye was still open while the other was closed, and one arm extended in a position of holding his rifle, which lay beside him on the ground."
The troops on both sides must live in the middle of this untold death and suffering. Horatio Chapman records the experience in his diary.
The dead in some places were piled upon each other, and the groans and moans of the wounded were truly saddening to hear. Some were just alive and gasping, but unconscious. Others were mortally wounded and were conscious of the fact that they could not live long.
By the time of the North's final victory, over 600,000 men on both sides are dead. Some 2% of the entire US population. In current terms, that's the equivalent of 6 million people. Almost half of the dead remain unidentified. The fear of dying, forgotten on the battlefield, leads soldiers for the first time to begin pinning their names and units on their uniforms. These crude identity tags make it possible to identify their bodies after they're killed. For the first time, America's growing postal service means soldiers can write to their loved ones from the front. With none of today's military censorship, it allows soldiers like Robert Stiles to relay the terrifying realities of life on the front line.
The sights and smells that assailed us were simply indescribable. Corpses swollen to twice their original size. Some of them actually burst asunder with the pressure of foul gases and vapors.
Fueling this carnage lies the deep political animosity that has led to this war. In a bitter conflict that has pitted brother against brother, the southern states are determined to defend their independence and their system of slavery. But the North will not allow them to leave the Union of States.
We fought and lost hundreds of thousands of men on both sides, fighting for what they believed was right.
The unholy alliance of new weapons and outdated battle tactics means a body count on an industrial scale. The war is locked in a bloody stalemate. Neither side can land a decisive blow. In this bitter war of attrition, victory will come to the last man standing. August 1862, over a year into the war. General Robert E. Lee's Southern Confederate Army is preparing a wide-ranging assault against Union forces in Virginia. Highly motivated, these men are fighting on their home turf and are ready to die for Southern independence, its traditions, and its rural way of life. Its prosperity is built around a simple crop: cotton. Known as white gold, the South accounts for 2/3 of the world's supply of cotton. It brings extraordinary wealth to the southern states. But it is wealth built upon the backs of slaves. Now, the victory of President Lincoln at the ballot box threatens this traditional way of life and the slavery it is built on. Rather than submit to Northern rule, the South decides to fight. They want a separate nation. General Robert E. Lee takes command at the head of the newly formed Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Lee, a brilliant graduate of the elite West Point Academy, is already a veteran of the Mexican War and highly regarded for his effectiveness on the battlefield.
Lee could intuit the battlefield in a way that almost resembles Rommel in World War II or Patton. And as a result, he could sort of almost sense where the place would be to take the gamble and where to hit.
Manassas, Virginia, 1862. Confederate troops gather ahead of the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lee's forces are heavily outnumbered. But this Virginia woodland is home territory these volunteer troops know like the back of their hand. Rigid training and strict discipline have turned them into a formidable fighting force.
If you'd been a betting man back then, you would have bet the South would have won. The South only had to hold its territory. The North had to come and take it away. The North had to be the occupying force, which is far harder to do.
At Bull Run, Lee easily demonstrates his forces' superiority. In one engagement, lasting 10 minutes, the Northern 5th New York Regiment loses more men than any other regiment during the entire Civil War. All told, Lee's men kill over 1,700 Union soldiers. Determination and local knowledge give the South their greatest victory in the war to date. But Lee and his commanders have underestimated the nature of this conflict and of their opponent, President Abraham Lincoln. Because Lincoln is fighting a totally new kind of war. And his southern adversaries just don't get it. A packed train speeds on its way south, ready to replenish the Union Army with fresh troops and supplies. Lieutenant George Benedict writes home,
We were stowed away in freight cars and started out of the city. The train took 600 other troops besides our regiment and numbered 34 heavily loaded cars.
the railways, one of Lincoln's hidden weapons in this war. In one key operation ordered directly by the President, 25,000 fresh troops are sent on a 2,000-kilometer journey to the south. By road, it would take over 2 months. By rail, it would take these men just 7 days. Following its introduction in the 1830s, America's rail infrastructure has gradually spread its tentacles across the country. Lincoln realizes it can revolutionize the speed of troop deployments. He strikes a deal with the rail owners to put the North's rail network under government control. With it, the railways become a weapon of war.
Instead of armies being limited to the speed at which they could march, all of a sudden you had armies being able to move to the front by rail, and more importantly, supplies.
Supplies and troops pour out of the north towards the battlefront. Some busy lines carry over 700 tons of supplies a day, the equivalent of 80 wagons worth. In Lincoln's hands, the North's 38,000-kilometer rail network becomes an arm of his war machine. Against this, the South's network is just 14,500 kilometers at the start of the war, and it remains under private control. In the 4 years the war lasts, the North adds 6,500 kilometers of new track to its network, against just 650 kilometers in the South. This inability to coordinate rail supplies will prove disastrous for the South. In the winter of 1863, poor rail links mean Southern troops starve, even though they're just 50 kilometers from their capital in Richmond. For all their brilliance and determination in battle, the Southerners simply lack the logistics to deliver a decisive blow. Lincoln not only uses rail, he realizes that victory depends on mobilizing the entire industrial might of the North behind the war effort. Production of clothing in the North doubles during the conflict. Pitchfork manufacturers start making swords, while the number of patents doubles in the course of the war. Manufacturing, technology, infrastructure. It will change the face of America. For the first time in history, industry is put behind the war effort, an approach to conflict that America will exploit in the First and Second World Wars. It is the beginning of a new integrated economy that will become the hallmark of the modern United States. In a building across the road from the White House is a small room which will become President Lincoln's nerve center in this war. And at its heart, a simple device that will transform how this war is fought and won. The telegraph. The invention of Morse code in 1844 turns the telegraph into America's first tool of mass communication. Quickly encoded, the basic system of dots and dashes is ideal for brief messages. Like Twitter today, it needs just seconds to send them and transcribe them. Where messengers previously took days on horseback over hundreds of miles and across every kind of terrain, now the country's 80,000-kilometer telegraph network means communication is almost instantaneous. As telegraph poles snake out alongside the railways, this vast country begins to shrink. It will transform the nature of this war, as information and decisions can flow backwards and forwards at lightning speed.
It became kind of the early version of email. Suddenly it was possible to get a message to somebody from St. Louis, to get a message to New York in a shockingly short amount of time.
Lincoln immediately realizes the telegraph's potential as a weapon of war. He insists on the installation of telegraph lines directly into the War Department. And he quickly acts to place all telegraph facilities in the Union under military control. The telegraph offices become the central hub of Lincoln's war operation, his command and control center. He even takes to sleeping here at busy times. The telegraph office manager, David Homer Bates, describes how Lincoln obsesses over every scrap of news from the front, sometimes reading dispatches word by word as they are deciphered.
Lincoln's habit was to go immediately to the drawer each time he came into our room and read over the telegrams, beginning at the top until he came to the one he had seen on his previous visit.
The North's telegraph network spreads its tentacles far and wide, sucking information back to Lincoln and his commanders in Washington. It gives him a vast strategic overview, providing him an unrivaled insight into his commander's tactical thinking.
Lincoln himself was able to stay on top of literally hour-by-hour developments in the course of individual battles. That had never happened before.
To the irritation of his generals, it even allows him to issue his own direct orders, telling them how to fight. In one campaign, with Confederate General Lee's forces threatening Washington, Lincoln responds by telegraphing direct orders to his generals.
The exposed position of General Banks makes his immediate relief a point of paramount importance. You are therefore directed by the President to move against Jackson at Harrisonburg. This movement must be made immediately.
In the course of the war, Lincoln sends almost 1,000 telegrams from his small office. But the South never grasps the potential of the telegraph in creating a centralized command and control system. It means Southern generals like Lee must plan their battles without that kind of strategic overview. As the war continues, Lincoln brings down the hammer of his war machine. Industry, lines of communication and supplies, manpower and firepower are all marshaled to deliver blow after blow to the Confederate Army. But the South, bolstered by the belief in the rightness of its cause, doggedly refuses to give in. As a result, the death toll just keeps rising. At Antietam in 1862, 6,000 are killed, 17,000 wounded. over 3 times the number of US casualties from World War II's D-Day landings. The carnage will trigger a revolution in battlefield medicine. Three-quarters of all operations conducted by Army surgeons during the Civil War are amputations. Letters from Surgeon William Watson record what these battlefield hospitals were like.
Day before yesterday, I performed 14 amputations without leaving the table. I do not exaggerate when I say I have performed, at the least calculation, 50 amputations. There are so many severely wounded through the joints. There are so many operations yet to be performed.
Surgeon Theodore Diamond describes the hideous wounds left by weapons like the mini-ball.
The shattering, splintering, and splitting of a long bone by the impact of a mini-ball is both remarkable and frightening.
An experienced surgeon can hack off a limb in just 10 minutes. Ether and chloroform are used as anesthetics. If a bullet doesn't kill you, then infection can. Gangrene is the greatest killer. Deprived of oxygen, wounds become an ideal breeding ground for Clostridium, a bacteria that releases poisonous toxin, destroying tissue. Death can follow quickly. Approximately 60,000 amputations are performed during the Civil War, more than in any other war America has fought in. Twice as many soldiers die from infected wounds and disease as on the battlefield. This unprecedented carnage forces a complete rethink of traditional battlefield medicine. Looking after the well-being of soldiers becomes as central to the war effort as the supply of guns and ammunition. Large numbers of women sign up as battlefield nurses. One of them is Clara Barton. Clara Barton is untrained and unpaid. When she starts, most nurses are men. It's a menial occupation. The remedies she proposes for the care of the wounded are simple but revolutionary in their effect.
They want food, clothing, shelter, medicines, and a few calm, practical persons to administer them.
She insists the injured have a ready supply of clean bandages. First aid. The sorting of the wounded to put the most serious cases first. The Civil War brings in a series of innovations that form the basis of battlefield medicine to this day. 20,000 women sign on as nurses during the war. Clara Barton herself goes on to found the American Red Cross. Standards of hygiene begin to dramatically improve with the discovery of bromine. This caustic chemical is effective against the bacteria that cause gangrene. As a result, nearly 3/4 of amputees survive surgery, and gangrene becomes rare by the war's end. With the Civil War dragging on without a clear end in sight, Lincoln is increasingly forced to fight on a very different front: the war for public opinion. The spread of portable cameras means for the first time gory images of the battlefield can now reach every home. While these simple cameras rule out dramatic action scenes, they're ideal for capturing the gruesome aftermath of battle. As many as 1,500 photographers flood the battlefield. Their images are sold cheaply to members of the public for as little as 25 cents.
It was war photography coming back from the Civil War that captured it in a way, made it real, and made people recognize the really extraordinary, unprecedented violence.
America's growing newspaper mass media reproduces simple woodcuts of the images. More than 200 correspondents cover the war, filing over 100 million words of copy. This deluge of information about the war ensures the grim reality of this conflict is seared into the public consciousness. Never again will politicians be able to fight wars without public support. The war means a soldier is 5 times more likely to die than a civilian. Where American families were used to grieving for their dead at home, now men die on the battlefield. It forces a fundamental shift in the rituals surrounding death. Nat Bottage dies on a battlefield in Virginia. Yet his family in Boston can still say goodbye to their son, killed 800 kilometers away. Even though it has taken a week for his body to travel from the battlefield, his father describes how it is free of any signs of decomposition.
Though the marks of closely contested battle were still upon the face, the features were placid, as if he was sleeping.
That's because of the new technique known as embalming. Chemicals like arsenic and zinc chloride are injected into the corpse to halt the natural process of decay. The business of death and the preservation of bodies turns undertakers into overnight millionaires. One undertaker boasts,
I would be glad to prepare private soldiers. They were worth a $5 bill apiece. But Lord bless you, a colonel pays 100, and a brigadier general, 200.
If you've got the money, all sorts of new techniques are available. Airtight coffins in embalming are most popular, and for the wealthiest, even elaborate refrigerated coffins packed with ice. The war drags on. Lincoln is determined to end it and abolish slavery. In September 1862, he gives the South an ultimatum. Rejoin the Union. He threatens to forcibly liberate Southern slaves if they refuse. But, having tasted independence, The South does not want to rejoin a union where slavery would be at risk. They reject the ultimatum. Lincoln is in no mood to negotiate. If the South won't free their slaves, he will do it himself.
For white Southerners, it was a confirmation that their thoughts about Lincoln all along, that he was, in fact, somebody who was bent on destroying what they thought was the Southern way of life. In the North, in a sense, it gave people a different understanding of what the war was about.
On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues a proclamation abolishing slavery in the rebellious southern states. Thanks to the telegraph, the news quickly spreads.
On the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1860,
Lincoln had totally grown to where he said that not only should blacks not be slaves, they should be treated as equal citizens with full enfranchisement, right to vote, right to participate.
all persons held as slaves shall be then, henceforth, and forever free.
In the wake of President Lincoln's emancipation of the slaves, black American soldiers rushed to enlist for the Union. Almost 200,000 sign up by the end of the war. General James Blunt describes their skill as fighters.
I never saw such fighting as was done by the Negro Regiment. They make better soldiers in every respect than any other troops I have ever had under my command.
The proclamation ending slavery changes the dynamics of the war. The Union Army becomes a force for liberation, now fighting to end slavery.
They understood that saving the Union would give them some sense of freedom, some sense of dignity. It was the dignity that I'm a soldier. I'm not just a servant. I'm a soldier. I have a uniform. I have stripes. I'm somebody.
Lincoln follows the proclamation with his masterstroke. His 1863 address at Gettysburg, dedicating America's first national cemetery for soldiers, is one of the most famous political speeches in history.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth.
It is an emotional thing to think about people sacrificing, giving their lives for an ideal. And it's Lincoln at his absolute best. The genius, the simplicity that conveys a great amount.
It's spiritual in a way. It's a hymn to America. And
It's the hymn to the possibilities and the great sacrifices of this country.
But in 1864, the war remains deadlocked. With an election looming and a challenge coming from those who want to negotiate a peace with the South, Lincoln knows he needs to land a decisive blow.
At some point, somebody gets tired. Somebody blinks. Somebody makes a mistake. And when you're talking about war, that mistake, that's everything.
Lincoln puts the North's entire industrial might behind one final push. The man who will lead the charge from Chattanooga to Atlanta, General William Sherman. His orders to stop for nothing.
I would make this war as severe as possible and show no symptoms of tiring till the South begs for mercy.
Advancing under the cover of night, General Sherman's march is sustained by one of the greatest logistical operations yet seen in this conflict. Sherman knows he needs to throw everything he's got at the Confederate Army. While he uses his own supply lines to maximum effect, he destroys those of the South, ripping up their railway lines and bending them beyond use. In one day, the North's supply lines replaced 200,000 bullets. While the South is left scavenging on the battlefield for spent rounds, food, even old boots. Sherman calls it total war, a scorched earth approach that becomes the trademark of modern warfare. Finally, with Atlanta under siege, Confederate forces set fire to their own munition stores. Before abandoning their city to the Union soldiers. Sherman's tactics of total war have won out. His victory helped secure Lincoln's election in the autumn. With Atlanta in ruins, he just keeps going, now launching his final assault, the famous March to the Sea. In a 19th century equivalent of shock and awe, 62,000 Union soldiers wreak a 100-kilometer wide path of destruction across Georgia. From Atlanta to the coast of Savannah. Supply lines are cut. Villages are sacked and crops torched. Anything of military value is destroyed. Within 6 months, General Lee has tendered the Confederate Army's surrender. The rebellion is over. The South will have to submit to the Union and bring an end to slavery.
By the act of winning, the North both validated freedom and validated the industrial model. And so you have an American confidence, an American sense of achievement, an American willingness to go out around the world.
For all the Confederacy's commitment, its inferior logistical infrastructure has been no match for the North's unstoppable war machine. Its industrial heartland, its growing rail infrastructure, its telegraph network, all bring victory to the North. Within a week, Lincoln would lie dead, killed by an assassin's bullet. But America had pulled back from the brink. The American nation is once again united, and out of that unity now grows a modern industrialized economy that will spread right across the United States.